Alrighty, everyone. So Force Throw has been in the ground for a few days now, and I want to talk about just a few of the decks to be on the lookout for. What I consider to be three of the best decks. Again, not 100% guaranteed. We got to see what the meta looks like, of course, and what spicy things people are playing, but just ones that immediately catch my eye as some really powerful contenders after the Force Throw ban. It's kind of interesting because the Force Throw ban has really opened up a lot of different options for certain decks, in that one of the biggest things that it prevents is a lot of earlier focused, aggression type strategies where you're relying on some bigger units that can just get killed by a one resource event. That's pretty tough. On the other note, not having the ability to interact with your hand because you're getting cards picked apart from it is also something that helps out, especially ramp decks. And so we will see what people decide to bring. But today we're going to talk about the three that I think are on everyone's mind, to be honest. I don't think these are hot takes at all. With that said, a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and let's dive into the first one today. Probably one of the most clear, biggest winners has got to be Sabine Green. This deck is already top 5 in the meta, and it has been basically since its inception. Okay, it has, not basically, it just has been top 5 since its inception. Sometimes number 1, sometimes number 2, sometimes number 3 in top 5. It has always been a stellar deck. With the Force Throw bans, for one, Sabine Green wasn't playing it, so it didn't actually make this deck any weaker. However, Force Throw was one of the best cards for a lot of decks to actually recoup in the game, to actually stay in the game up against such an aggressively focused deck like Sabine. Paying one resource to remove a Sabine from the battlefield, or paying one resource to remove a Poe Dameron or a K2, or even just on turn 2 paying one resource to remove their turn 2 play, and then following it up with your own additional turn 2 play, or turn 1 play rather, then you can really get the tempo advantage. So the best thing that Sabine is finding herself up against now is the fact that your opponent has to invest a lot more resources to deal with a lot of the units that you have on the board, instead of just throwing a Crate Dragon at your 5 toughness, or throwing a Crate Dragon and just killing anything on the board whatsoever. This doubles up, right? You don't get affected because of the Force Throw. The decks that are playing Force Throw are weaker because one of the best interaction pieces is Force Throw, and you're an aggro deck. This seems pretty straightforward to me, and I think Sabine Green is going to be a deck to really pay attention to, because it is, at least in the current moment, the go-to aggro deck that I would consider straight up aggro, right? You have an action that deals direct damage. You're still playing cards like For a Cause. You've got this ECL, which is extreme, kind of, in Wrecker's case, direct damage into the base with Overwhelm, or just burn with things like Poe Dameron. It is a very scary list, and has been since the, again, inception of the game, but even more so now. The second list we got to talk about is one that has been on a lot of people's minds since set 5, and that is Boba Fett Data Vaults. Always loving to see another Boba Fett in the top echelons of the meta, as if we haven't seen enough of him already. But we have a very strong contender as Boba Fett being one of the decks that, again, didn't get affected by the Force Throw and was already considered top 3 in the meta. Very similar to Sabine. Didn't get affected, already a good deck. Could be considered already a top 3 list no matter what. So I don't think this is a hot take at all in saying Boba Fett Data Vault is just going to be better. You now have, if you deploy Boba Fett as a pilot onto one of your big space units, not many real options to deal with that, right? Your Rival's Fault obviously will still deal with it, but before it was like Force Throw is in so many decks that even decks that normally would not have been able to deal with a big leader now can deal with a big leader. And oftentimes that big leader is one of the most important steps in the deck, because deploying Boba, getting the 4 damage, and then overlaying Barrage is an extremely popular kind of turn that people will run to recoup in the game. Because you're playing things like Resupply as an example, and a lot of early game removal, the kind of goal of this deck is to really just pelt down your opponents with some indirect damage, and then use Boba Fett's flip plus the Overwhelming Barrage to wipe the board, or, kind of maintain stability once Boba Fett comes down. And now your leader is much more likely to survive because of Force Throw. But that's not all. I mean, Boba Fett was actually in a situation where you can play a very aggressive game. You can be playing things like Pride on turn 1 into, a turn 2, heck, even like a droid missile platform. And suddenly the Pride, you attack, you get 4 damage in because your opponent has to deal to their base in most cases. But then you get an extra one for Boba Fett, so it's 5 damage, a couple of indirect points. Droid missile platform gets a 4 powered space unit that it dies, it gets by indirect damage. You load that into a Fett's fire spray, and suddenly you have the most absurd curve in that most Star Wars Unlimited decks can't even come close to compete with, right? Pride with the initiative plus droid missile platform plus Fett's fire spray is really tough to come back from. Follow that up with a Dornian gunship and then a Boba Fett deploy with a Ruthless Raider. I mean, you are in trouble, okay? You are in trouble. And now the opponents, most decks, aren't really running all that much space interaction or space units. It comes with their interaction, and Force Throw was one of the key cards within that style. Very cheap, allow you to deploy more ground units while interacting with your opponent's space units. No longer have that. I think Boba Fett is going to be even more scary from the aggressive point of view, but also having their leaders live. It is a very scary proposition here. And for the third deck, I'm actually going to be putting Quinlan Tarkintown on the list. And this, I don't know, maybe comes as a surprise. I'm not sure. I think a lot of people have played against Quinlan Tarkintown know just how strong the deck is, even without playing Force Throw. Now, mind you, this deck does run a couple of cards that are kind of indexing towards Force Throw. It depends on the list, of course, so you're probably going to want to shift the list a little bit. However, Quinlan Tarkintown was considered, and in terms of results, is just the best deck in the format, or was before the Force Throw ban. Is it going to be the best deck in the format? I think, Sabine and Boba have a very good chance of edging the Quinlan out in terms of, someone's going to make a meme out of that. I know it is. I say, you say something and then you realize you're recording. You're like, oh man, it's over. Anyways, I think Force Throw is good. Don't get me wrong. Out of the 3 decks here, Quinlan's the only one that's actually losing a card with the Force Throw ban. That said, the core of Quinlan is not Force Throw. It never has been. It's been the interaction between his ability and Tarkintown and dominating the early game, following up with very powerful threats. And it still does exactly that. You still have things like turn 1 L337 or X34 land speeder, or whatever other 2-drop, A-Wing, sometimes Adi Gallia, all that nonsense. Kill their turn 1 play. Turn 2, follow that up with a Guerrilla Soldier. They probably take a bunch of damage into their base and get the Guerrilla Soldier immediately readied up. And suddenly, you've already dealt, 7, 8 damage to your opponent's base. You've got 2 units on the board. Your opponent has 1, maybe 1 that's damaged because of Quinlan's ability. And you follow it up with, turn 3 with a Quinlan Vos that sets up for an amazing turn into ambush, ambush, ambush. And suddenly you're like, okay, I cannot come back from this game. And that's kind of the core of Quinlan. What's interesting is this is a list that just kind of really showcases the strength of Tarkintown. Now, I do think if you were to kind of compare this to maybe Cad Bane, I think Cad Bane could also have another opportunity to really show its strength. But again, what I mentioned about Sabine, the reason why I have Quinlan still on the list is one of the best answers to Quinlan was Force Throw as well, in terms of discarding your own cards to really get rid of some of the early game threats. Now, it's a little bit of risky play against Quinlan because they do have Ahsoka Tano's, they've got Force Throw themselves in the past, but, nowadays, you no longer have the ability to kind of remove a lot of the early game units. And that can be a little bit tricky because it is a very, very heavy, damaging deck. And Force Throw is one of the cards that, in some cases you can Force Throw your opponent. In Quinlan's case, just because you are an opponent's case up against Quinlan. And now you're not going to be able to do that because their Force Throw doesn't exist. And your opponent is just going to be focusing in on putting things on the board and getting in for some damage. Now, is it going to be a good amount weaker? Yes, I do think that is the case. But I think because other decks aren't going to be able to interact with a lot of early game strategies all that well anymore either. Well, I shouldn't say all that well. Depends on the deck, of course. But certain lists are not going to do all that well up against these really, really hyper aggro lists / very, very early game dominant lists. Force Throw is one of the key cards in returning to parity, and that's what I've continuously mentioned in this video. So I think Quinlan's still going to have a chance at being one of the best decks in the format, potentially still top 3, although I could see it being, top 5, even like top 10, depending on what people decide to start bringing. And I think that's what's interesting about it. I think Sabine and Boba Data Vault are kind of clear winners. After which, I think there's so many arguments you could make. You can make an argument for Cad Bane Tarkintown. You can make an argument for Gar Saxon ECL. You can make an argument for Iden Data Vault. You can make an argument for Palpatine Yellow, who's been actually performing very, very exceptionally. You can make an argument for so many different lists. Han Blue, even, I don't think got super harmed by this. But I do think the play patterns for a lot of these decks, because Force Throw was so prevalent through the top 10s, lists, a lot of the lists that you're going to be finding yourselves up against are weaker, and therefore your deck didn't get all of that much weaker in of itself because a lot of decks got affected. Sabine and Boba are the 2 clear winners in my eyes. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. What lists are you happy to see a little bit nerfed? And are you happy to see Force Throw gone? Is it like, oh yes, let's celebrate and let's get in some games? This weekend is going to be the very first weekend we're going to see some results from the tournaments taking place to see what is actually showing up. Is it going to still be a Quinlan, Boba Data Vault, Han Blue, Sabine Green meta? Or is it going to be, there's people showing up with their Kazuda Tarkintowns, because now your Kazuda actually lives when you deploy it on a space unit instead of getting Force Thrown out of the game. Whereas in other situations, you can't really deal with that as early on in the game. I don't know, but that's what we're here to find out. And I'll see you all for the next one.